Well, good morning. Happy to be here. It's Friday the 13th. Did you know that? Anyway, let me just start and kind of go through what I want to talk about. I'll give you a couple breaks, one kind of in the middle, one toward the end to kind of process what we're doing, and we'll just see where we go. So, this is my welcome. I don't know if I get confused with these things. I'll read a little bit, yeah. So, I'm happy to be here to talk with you about adulthood. For me, adulthood is the fullness of the human, and what that might look like, and then what adult faith might look like. Because I think the challenge of Jesus is for us to be adults and to have an adult faith. And I'm trying to offer some ways to look at these. This is not the gospel, but it's my way of trying to understand what's in the gospel in a sense, what's there. The gospel is very good at talking about who God is and very good at talking about our relationship with God, but it doesn't say a lot about who we are except in that context. And so I'm trying to surface the human. Who is the human? Who are we as human and as approaching adulthood as we relate to God? Those are the questions that are important. So this presentation, part one, I want to talk about adulthood, what is an adult? And part two then, what is adult faith? Pretty clear? Pretty simple? Good. So part one, what is an adult? I think there are two essential hallmarks for being an adult. And the first is that an adult self is its own whole. It has integrity. It is integrity. And the second is that this whole or integral self relates in considered mutuality to whomever or whatever is other. I think that makes us adults. So let me talk about its own whole, this integrity. An adult self, quite simply, is a self that has grown up, a self that has come into its own possession. It's its own person, able to stand on its own 2 feet. As we become adult, our locus of valuing moves from significant others who are outside of us to a place within the self. That's crucial. We have within our own selves our valuing process. It's not what others tell us. We have to own that ourselves. It's from within. So as we become adult, we become our own cohesive, felt from within, self-authoring whole. So a little bit more on that. The more adult and the more moral I become, the more integrity and mutuality necessarily go together. I believe they can't be divided. As I realize the one, I realize the other. And here's my understanding of integrity. People love integrity for different reasons. Everyone's looking for people with integrity. But what does it mean? I think it means that the self owns all of its pieces. The loved and the unloved, the comfortable and the uncomfortable, the good and the bad. That's hard. And I think that's hard for us to become adult because it's hard for us often to own all the pieces, all of our experiences, especially if there's some experiences that were not very good or very shameful or traumatic or whatever. It makes it very difficult. What's considered mutuality? An adult self relates to whomever or whatever is other. I think family members, spouse, friend, events, groups, communities, institutions, animals, or the environment, any other you can think of, in a way that respects that other's difference, individuality, and boundaries. When we become adult, we relate to the other in whatever integrity that other has, with genuine concern for its unique character, particular history, and special needs. Does it make some sense? We okay? Yeah. That's considered mutuality. A little bit more on that. There's 3 pieces that are in there that I'd like to simply highlight. First, considered mutuality finds the unique wholeness of the other. It's kind of what we just said. That's what we do if we relate to others in mutuality. We're trying to find what makes them uniquely themselves, their unique wholeness. Secondly, considered mutuality is love and care for the other. It's quite simple, I think. Adults love and care for the other. It's not something that would be nice if we did. If we're adults, we do that. I think it's a hallmark of being an adult. And thirdly, considered mutuality insists on justice for the other. To me, that's what considered mutuality looks like. So, wholeness and mutuality. So it seems that integrity and mutuality go together, and that's the point. I'd like to make one of the reasons we revere people who have integrity is because we say, oh, that person has great integrity, and we look at them like there's something inside them that's just wonderful. But I think what really attracts us to people with integrity is that they relate in mutuality. They show respect for everybody. They have love and care for everyone. They insist on justice. That's why we're so comfortable with people with integrity. It's not just in them, it's the relating to everyone else that makes that important. So integrity and mutuality, and we have to be clear here, as close as we can get to them, because we all have unfinished pieces, shortcomings, blind spots, cultural distortions. So, but even with all that, there's two things. It's the fullness of the human and a good description of what it means to be an adult. I want to talk about, out of those three ways that adults function. And I think this is especially helpful for understanding who we are in church today, because these are things I think we struggle with. So let me talk about these. One is voice, the second is intimacy, and the third is dialogue. So voice, these are just some pieces of it. Adult voice is from our integrity, from the whole of our embodied selves and our experience. We need to say who we are and what we have come to know. We need to have a voice if we're adults. So voice is an invitation to make clear to ourselves and to others what we attest to, what we value, what's right, what's true. And there's a book, Women's Ways of Knowing, and it was very influential for me. Some of you may know the book, Women's Ways of Knowing. This is part of what they say. To have a voice is to have a self. And not to have a voice is in some ways not to exist, and certainly not to be in relationship. So a little more on voice. So to honor the other's voice is to respect the other and to acknowledge the other as an adult, or as at least on the way to becoming their own whole. Not to honor the other's voice is to treat the other as not being an adult. It's an absence of integrity. It's a denial of mutuality. If we don't listen to the other's voice, that's what happens. We denigrate their integrity. We deny mutuality. Not to honor the other's voice is to withhold loving care and justice. And then the question I always love, did Jesus respond to voice? And I'm just amazed, if you go through the Gospels, how Jesus responded to people's pleas, to what they said, especially when people cried out. The voice of the woman wanting justice late at night, knocking on the judge's door. I love that story. Why? It's like, she had voice. What is she asking for? She's asking for justice. And so voice, I think, was absolutely crucial for Jesus. His own voice, clearly, but also listening to the voice of the other, which had obviously a profound impact on him. So voice is crucial. There's more. Well, yeah, there is more. Intimacy. We don't talk much about intimacy, but I want to try to flesh some of it out, what I think it should look like in adulthood. It is voice that invokes closeness and intimacy. Voice invites intimacy. Here we are here now, we're talking to each other. Voice is something that kind of calls us to each other. It calls for intimacy. We have two paradigms for learning that we usually get, and one is sight. And sight says, oh, can you see that? And it's something objective at a distance. And the other paradigm for learning and for knowing is voice. It's what we can share together. It's really something that invites intimacy. And the knowing and the learning comes from the sharing, from the intimacy. So intimacy is to welcome the feeling and depth of the other. into the feeling and depth of the self. That's to me what intimacy is and what it does. So intimacy honors the inner of the self, even as it honors the inner of the other. There's more. Empathy and intimacy go together. Without empathy, we cannot know the inner of the other. Adults have self-empathy. They're comfortable with their own inner. They can own their own inner, own all their own pieces, as we said. And adults have empathy for the other person. That's how we know the other. That's intimacy. And I love this quote from Judith Jordan. Crucial to a mature sense of mutuality, observes Judith Jordan, is an appreciation of the wholeness of the other person with a special awareness of the other's subjective experience. That's a great quote. That's intimacy. That's empathy. It's crucial. That's a beautiful quote. And did Jesus pay attention to the inner? And again, I love this question, because if you look, Jesus all the time was talking about the inner. He says, not the outside of the cup, it's the inner. It's not what comes out. It's not what goes into a person that makes them unclean. It's what comes out. I mean, he feasted on the inner. That's adult. That's who we are. That's intimacy. Making sense? We okay? Okay. Dialogue. Dialogue is an exercise in voice and an exercise in intimacy. This is adult dialogue. This is what it's meant to be, I think. It's an exercise in voice and an exercise in intimacy. Dialogue is on the basis of the whole self's experience. Welcome the other's experience. Dialogue doesn't work when we talk about different positions that we hold. Dialogue works when one person shares experience with the other and the other shares experience back. That's how we learn. That's intimate. That's when voice is heard. That's how it works. So dialogue is the wholeness of the self engaging the other in mutuality. In dialogue, often both parties change or are changed. Adult dialogue is often a way of transformation. I think is how it happens. A little more dialogue. I love this. I keep saying this all the time. Adults dialogue. I think it's as simple as that. Adults dialogue. That's what they do. That's what they need to do. It's who we are in this kind of framework that we're talking about. Without the possibility of dialogue, voice is silenced and intimacy in relationship is thwarted. Without knowing the inner of each other, two things happen. Change and transformation do not occur, and the adult integrity and mutuality of both parties is compromised. The Jesus dialogue. Yeah, all over the place. He was in dialogue with anyone, with everyone. The woman at the well. I mean, it's dialogue that's happening. The inner of him being revealed by the inner. Jesus changed in that story at the woman at the well. He changed. He became different in relating to her. She brought things out of him that he had never said before. And he brought things out of her that you didn't know. That's change. That's transformation. That's dialogue. Well, it's early in the morning. And this is kind of heavy in its own way, so we're going to have a little interlude. Can you briefly talk, one or two people next to you, maybe at the table in general, does any of this understanding of adulthood make sense to you? And do you think voice, intimacy, and dialogue go together in adults? Take maybe 5, 6, 7 minutes, just talk among yourselves. Does this make any sense? What do you want to hold on to? What do you want to challenge? Grapple with this. Before I let this piece go and start to talk about adult faith, I'd just like to make one observation, which for me is kind of like a benchmark or whatever. And it's kind of an imago Dei theology. And it's this. If we're in the image and likeness of God, and if being adult is the fullness of the human, and if that's in integrity and mutuality, is God integrity and mutuality? And guess what? To me, that's a great definition of the Trinity. Integrity and mutuality. If we're in the image and likeness of God, That's who we are. And when we're fully ourselves, we're integrity and mutuality, I think we're fully in the image and likeness of God. Make some sense? So, part 2. I want to start talking about adult faith. And this is pretty much from the book. I don't want to make the case for it, and I want to do it the way I did it there because I think it's the clearest way I know how to do it. These are questions in the book. The book is really about this. What got me started trying to work on this was, why is our relating to God so often presented as if it were something static and not something meant to develop as we ourselves develop and mature? And coming out of that, the question then is, why are so many adults still living with a God of childhood and adolescence, what I call a superego God? And can we describe this God? And can we describe a God of adulthood, what I would like to call a living God? So that's what we want to do. So, I think then there's 2 paradigms of imaging God. There's a superego God paradigm, and there's a living God paradigm. So let me talk about the first, because the superego God paradigm has 3 components. There's an adolescing self. The word adolescing simply means still coming to adulthood. I love that word because as we're on the way to adulthood. So it's not like we're children, we are children, but we're on our way to adulthood. We're adolescing. And I want to say that while we're still coming to adulthood, the way we image reality is still coming to adulthood. It's still growing up. And so it's one way it's clear to say it, it's fettered. It's not completely realistic. It's not whole yet, because we're not whole yet. We're not integral yet. Our imaging is not whole yet. So we have fettered imaging. And so I want to say, while we're still growing up, and while our imaging is still not whole, fettered, the way we image God is not whole. And so an adolescent self with fettered imaging finds a superego God. So that's the thesis. So let's talk about adolescent self. And from the perspective of adulthood, it's pretty simple. There's 2 characteristics. We're still forming. We're still coming into our own whole. And as long as we're still forming, we're dependent on someone else to know who we are and what we should do. As long as we're still forming, we're dependent on something outside to be ourselves. So an adolescent self is still forming and still dependent, as it should be. That's what it is to grow up. That's the state we're in as we're growing. We're still forming, and we're still depending on other people to find out who we are and to find out what the right thing to do is and how we should be and even who we are, because we don't know. And everyone tells us who we are, and we're trying to sort that out, and we're trying to come to that ourselves. So, what's fettered imaging then? It's imaging of reality that's still forming and still dependent. And it has 3 strands. I think the strands make it kind of easy to see. There's a lot of fantasy in fettered imaging. Fantasy is typically what I wish were there or what I think needs to be there in order to make a picture that I can understand. So when we're little, we see reality with a lot of fantasy because we need to. And so we don't fully understand things, like when parents get divorced, little kids say, oh, it was my fault. It's my fault. That's typical. Little kids say, it's my fault that my parents got divorced. They don't see. They see little pictures. There's a lot of fantasy in that. What are they trying to do? They're trying to paint a picture of reality that makes sense to them. And that's what we do. But it may not be real at all. And as we get older, we say, oh, I understand now what was happening. It was this, and we have all these things, and we get, oh, now I see, now I understand. Before that, we don't see completely. So that's fantasy. Relating and transference, it's a word from Freudian thought, whatever. But the idea is we relate to others while we're still growing for what they can do for us to grow up. And the simple thing here is your mother and your father is your mother and your father. You know what I mean? We define that person in terms of who they are for us. If you think about it, that's what we do. Oh, that's my mother. No, my mother was Virginia, and she had a whole life before I knew her, and later, toward the end of her life, I got to know her in a completely different way, which is wonderful when that happens. It was kind of like an adult to adult way. That, you know what I'm talking about? Often that doesn't happen. But then I got to know, but before that, I'm growing up, that's my mother, that's my father. So, and we need that to get a sense of ourselves. So we relate in transference, drawing from others what we need for our own becoming. And this third piece is more coming out of the culture, and we get this, typically we get this in high school, because they say, oh, you gotta learn scientific method. And if you really want to know what's real, it's science. And we have all these procedures that'll tell you. And so that reality is objective. And we live in a culture that says that very much. So that you can objectively know things. And if it's not objective, it's not true, or you can't trust it, whatever. But then the older we get, relationships aren't objective. Most of the things in life aren't. Religion's not objective. Most of the things don't fit that paradigm. But we try to squeeze God into that paradigm. Even the churches try to do that. You know, logical proofs for the existence of God, like you can actually objectively talk about this. That's fettered imaging as well. So the logic of objective knowing. And we all get that, especially in high school. And later on as well. Nothing wrong with science, nothing whatsoever. But as a complete way of dealing with reality, it can't carry it. It doesn't carry. So, if we're adolescent selves and we have fettered imaging, then I want to say we find a superego God. And these are the 5 ways I describe this God. I'll say a little bit about each one. First, this superego God is a supreme being. And we all say that all the time. Almighty God, we say. You know. But the image, 2 things in this image, if you think about it. The first is power. This is a very powerful God. I think of Charlton Heston in the movies, you know. Yahweh is, you know what I mean? It's this amazingly powerful presence. But also, with the power, very distant. In fact, nothing like us at all. Completely other. And we use that phrase, wholly other. But at the same time, very much interested in what we do. Looking out for all the things that we do or don't do. So it's really an interesting thing that we have. But this idea of supreme being, that's when we're small. That's how we capture God. And it works in childhood and adolescence, and it works well. It does not work, I want to say, in adulthood, but we'll get to that. This supreme being turns out to be a God of law. And so there's all these laws that we learn, especially growing up. God is the law. Because if you obey the law, you're okay with God. God is law. The superego God is a God of law. And belief. Now, beliefs are very important. But here, God is the belief. It's like very important to have the right belief. Because if you have the right belief, then you have God. And a lot of people do a lot of things. There's a lot of discussion about who believes this and who believes in this isn't right. So, belief is a big thing. But God is in the belief. And the important thing is, to have the right belief is to have God. It's not a relationship. It's a belief. God's in the belief. And with all this, it's a God that we're dependent on, very much so. And of course you say, of course we're dependent on God. It's a God of dependency, but it's also a God that we're controlled by. And growing up, we don't like the dependency, or we do, And usually we don't like to control. And the question always is it my life to lead, or is it God's life? Who's in charge of my life? And so there's a question of dependency and a question of control. And where do we find this God? We find this God in the group. And I'm kind of defining the group simply as the place where the supreme being is celebrated. And the God of law and the God of belief and the God of dependency and control are celebrated as well. You could call that church, but if it's church, it's a superego kind of church. But that happens. So typically, the group is very important. And the group can be very, very reassuring and comforting, but the group also can be kind of cruel. You can be expelled from the group if you don't conform. There's some ambivalence about this group. That's the superego God. Let me say a little bit more to give some flavor of this. It's a God of good and evil together. Typically, we separate evil out. And typically at this level, it's like there's God and there's the devil. And they're fighting each other in competition. We're not sure how that's working, but there's God and there's the devil. And some people see evil in God, whatever. It's a God of good and evil. It's a God of conditional acceptance. You're loved if you obey, if you have the right beliefs, if you obey the law. This superego God is a God we know about and learn about. We get this God. We get it from the culture. We get it from organized religion. It's not a God of personal experience. You might say, well, yeah, that's my experience. That's what God is. But it's not a God of personal experience. It's not a relational God. It's the God of conventional religion, and it's very much the God understood in the culture. This is American religion. This is pretty much what it looks like. Does it make some sense? Get the picture? Okay. Oh, more. Oh, yeah, I want to talk about this. This is something helpful to say to yourself with the superego God. How do we hear this God? I mean, what's the communication like? How do we hear this God? The voice of this God can be kind and loving, but also can be critical. And often it is kind of critical because typically we don't conform too well. So it's interested in controlling the adolescent self through either love or fear. And typically it goes back and forth between love and fear. The other thing with this voice, it's usually immediate, there in the mind. It's in the mind, it's like it's in our head already, often loud, attacking, harsh, critical, judgmental, guilt-evoking, and punishing. All that good stuff. Yeah. And it's like you're thinking of doing something, you're a kid or a teenager, you're thinking of doing something bad or whatever, and the voice of the superior God says, you're thinking of what? Don't even think of, don't even think of doing that. You know? You hear this voice in your head. It's the superego God. That's what it sounds like. Harsh, loud, critical, judgmental. Typically that's how we hear God. How do we speak about this God? We talk about this God in literal terms, as we would talking about any other object. Because this God is the supreme being. It's like this supreme object. And we talk about it like we could describe it as an object. And we talk to this God very much as a child talks to an adult or to an authority figure. Because it's the superego God. Get the picture of that? Yeah. Our hope is that we've kind of left that behind. But not everyone and not always. And I have to say this, to leave the superego God is difficult because the superego God doesn't take rejection lightly. It's true, it does not. It takes courage, and what you need is some support from other people. You need, like, spiritual direction is good. Someone to support you in that journey, because if you're trying to get past the superego God, it feels like you're denying God. In some sense, it feels like you're losing your faith. The power of this God it's immense. It's very powerful God. So this is not an easy, we're talking like this, you just, well, I'll just change from the superego to something we're going to talk about next. It's very hard to do. You need support. You need support. And you need challenges. Typically, when people have severe illness or some kind of trauma, typically they either fly back to the superego God and with vengeance, or that they realize that the superego God didn't protect them, it wasn't there, whatever, and they move to something more adult. So often some kind of crisis has something to do with moving from the superego to the living God. Let me talk a bit about the living God. It's a paradigm, again, with three pieces: an adult self, unfettered imaging, and a living God. And so the paradigm is an adult self with unfettered imaging is able, not always does, but is able at least to find a living God. So let me talk about that. Adult self, we've already seen this. Two essential hallmarks of being an adult self. Adult self is its own whole, and this whole or integral self relates in considered mutuality to whomever, whatever is other. That's adult. We've been talking about that. Unfettered image is kind of simple in a way. This is an imaging of reality that comes freely and fully from the adult self. And one way to say it simply, secondly, is that it's an imaging of reality no longer hampered by fantasy. We don't have a lot of fantasy as adults. We're not relating in transference because we've grown up. We don't need others to be ourselves. And the logic of objective knowing goes by the way because we realize that most of the important things in life aren't objective, and we can't know them objectively. So, this is an imaging of reality that comes from the being whole, and it lets us find the wholeness of the other in considered mutuality. So that's how this imaging works. So, an adult self with unfettered imaging is able to find a living God. These characteristics of the living God are transformations of the characteristics of the superego God. So the living God is a God as thou. For some people, it's something like a spiritual presence. But for most people, it's personified, it's a thou. But the key thing here, it's relational. It's an experience of relationship. The superego God is not relational. This God is relational. And what is this God? It's not law anymore. The law was important, but the law was for the relationship. The law was for the love. To be with the God of thou. It's a God of love. And the beliefs are important, but the living God is a God of mystery, because we can never fully know. The beliefs don't begin to capture the reality of God. God is mystery. Mystery doesn't mean it's not something we know, we don't know. Mystery means there's something we enter into that we're part of. That's more than we can say, but that's real, very real. God is mystery. And the living God is not dependency and control anymore. It's a God of freedom. St. Augustine said, love God and do what you will. And I said, well, yeah, okay. Oh, yeah, anything? Oh, love God and do what you will. Yeah, great thing. For the book, I interviewed, it was not in the book, but I interviewed a moral theologian. And I was surprised. I said, what's your image of God? I said, I'm trying to understand. When you think of God, what image comes to your mind? And right away he said, freedom. Freedom. It's powerful. The living God is a God of freedom. God is freedom. And we enter into that freedom. Which again, that's some ways somewhat scary, whatever. And we're part of that. We participate in the freedom. We are with the God of freedom. The God of freedom is in us. It's the mutuality. And where do we find this God and where do we celebrate this God? It's the community. So this will be a nice segue for Jane. Because we desperately need the community, that's where we celebrate our experience of God. That's where we are in mutuality, to listen to other people and to learn from them and to see from them how God is in their lives and what differences this makes and what this means. You can't celebrate the living God by yourself. It doesn't work. Of course, in Christianity, it doesn't work at all. But you can't. You desperately need the community, but not with laws and not in a kind of rigid kind of super-ego God way. You need community to celebrate the living God. And liturgy is meant to do that. Good liturgy celebrates the living God. Good liturgy connects us with the God as thou. It's the celebration of the God of love. There's mystery there, and we know it. We're part of it. We can't name it necessarily, but we know it. We're part of it. If you leave good liturgy, and it's like you feel, you know what I mean? It's like you feel free. It's like it just enlivens you. It lets you be yourself. It's a freeing thing. Why? We're with the God of freedom. We celebrated that God, and that's what's there. And that's what community is. The liturgy is the community. It's the celebration of the community. It's the celebration of the living God in community. A little bit more. So the living God, we made this case, is a transformation of the superego God. The living God is a God of unconditional love, a God we relate to in mutuality and intimacy. Power's not a big thing. This God, the Almighty God, no. Is there power? If there is, it's a much more kind of personal sense. It's not the power. It's not Charlton Heston. It's not there. It's simply not there. This God doesn't promise salvation like the superego God does. To be with the living God is an experience of being healed, of coming to some kind of wholeness. It's an experience of salvation. That's the living God. Okay. So being with this living God, there's a kind of synergy or shared energy, an empowerment in God, which makes the adult self more integral, even as it moves the self deeper into the reality of the living God. So how do we hear this God? This is important to say. How am I with time? We getting? Fine? Good. How do we hear, how do we hear this God? This is hard to say, but I think very important to say. It's kind of like a voice, if you want to think of it that way, but it's in the wholeness of the body. It's like a voice that comes from within, from the inner, from the feeling and the depth that we have. So it's a voice of, and it's, for the body and its feeling and its depth. It's not this strong outer voice of the superego God, but there is a voice. But you have to kind of be quiet to listen to it, for it to surface and for it to come. It's not a demanding voice at all. It's very quiet, but it's there. It's the voice tends to be the voice of the self and God together, because with the living God, the self and God are together. It's a quiet inner voice of genuine care and concern for the self and for the other together. And I think this is a voice of conscience, of dialogue. It's a voice of vocation. People, I feel called to this, whatever, Called? Who called? It's voice. Okay? Where'd you hear this voice? Did someone call you? When I interviewed for the book, I asked people. A number of people said, I've heard God speaking to me. And they'd say, oh, no, I'm not crazy. And they'd all say, I'm not crazy. But they heard a voice. I think it's this kind of voice. And my hunch is a lot of us here have heard the voice, what it calls us to what we're doing. Is it God's voice? Yes. Is it my voice? Yes. Is it both? Yes. Is it quiet and gentle and wanting to draw us forward? Yes. I think that's what it's conscience, dialogue, and vocation. How do we speak about this God? We talk about this God in the language of metaphor. Adults love metaphor, and you can't speak about experience without using metaphor. Because anything personal, you have to say, it was really good. It was like, and we use some kind of metaphor. And you might say, I was here this morning, it was good, but, it was a little bit heavy. You might say that. Or it was like, ooh. We use metaphors. And we use metaphors for God. And you say, yeah, the Lord is my shepherd. Yeah, a shepherd? Yeah, well, yeah. It's metaphor. Metaphor is not a figure of speech. We were taught that in grade school and high school. It is, but you can use, but that's not what metaphor is. Metaphor is a way of touching the deeper parts of the self. It's the way of touching the body and its feeling and its depth. Literal words don't work, but metaphor works. And metaphor is just as true as literal language. It's adult, but it's even more true, but it's metaphor. So we talk to this God in metaphor also, because metaphor is the language of the whole self, of feeling and depth and intimacy. People, when they share intimacy, they use all these metaphors. And so they say honey and dear. What, anybody do this? Yeah. What? It's a metaphor, but it's the one that works. It captures the reality. And so, yeah. So, okay. Oh, yeah, an interlude. How are we for time?
Yeah, about 10 minutes.
Okay. Then we'll do questions later, or maybe...
We can do questions all together at the end, or we can do it now, up to you.
Okay.
We have about 10 minutes and we're going to take a break.
Okay. You know what I'd like, though? I'd like a little interlude to talk at the table. What are you hearing with this? Because some people won't ask questions and some people whatever. Take about 5 minutes just to process this at the table. Does this make any sense? Do any parts of this understanding of adult faith make sense to you? Does it make sense that the God we know about and learn about is so different from a God that we experience and have a mutual relationship with? Take a little bit of that. We have about maybe 5 minutes for questions. But before we do that, this summer I was on a directed retreat in New York, and the highlight of the retreat, a wonderful direction, but the highlight of the retreat was the liturgy. And the reason it was so good, I think, was that God is thou, God of love, God of mystery, freedom, community, was all beautifully celebrated. And the one who did the celebration, a former student of mine, Francis Gargani, who's here today, and a gift, and I want to say this even publicly, absolute gift, because the liturgy, when it's done that way, it's incomparable. So that's the piece. Liturgies here are good. If you experience that kind of liturgy, this gets celebrated, and it's crucial. Thank you.
Now, all the questions you were asking, John, at the end of the session, like, what do we do? How do we provide these opportunities? How do we do that? We're going to be looking at that. Don't have the answers to it, but I certainly have a way of framing the question and helping you to frame the question in your own pastoral setting. So as we're going to be looking at that is that notion of how we are and how we become, how we live out of and become an adult church. That should be an adult church. I realize it. Adult church. First of all, let me talk about some of the givens that I have. These givens are just things that if we were here for months and months, I would talk about this. But unless those doors get sprung short, my bet is that you're not going to want to stay much more than about an hour. Okay? So I've got a few things I just want to say that I'm just going to assume them. Okay? I'm not going to argue them, just so we're all on the same basic page. The first one is that the church, and therefore the local parish, exists in order to evangelize. In other words, what are we doing and why are we doing it? Everything we're doing, we have to hold it up against the call, the challenge, the invitation to the church to be an evangelizing agent. And by evangelization, I mean, and this is again from Evangelii Nuntiandi, Ian, evangelization is bringing the good news into all strata of humanity, and through its influence, transforming humanity from within and making it new. Okay? So it's not proselytizing, it's not bringing folks in, although it'd be lovely if we had more Catholics, and more smart Catholics would be even nicer, okay? But it's instead about sending us out, preparing us to go out. The faith community has a responsibility, therefore, to fashion adults who engage in service for membership and, more importantly, for mission. And more importantly, to be evangelizing agents, okay? To be people whose lives are transformative and inviting and give evidence of God's presence okay? So that people say, wow, you know, and they ask us for the reason for our hope. Okay, that's evangelizing, okay? All right, which means, therefore, when we're talking about adult church and evangelizing church, those are pretty much the same thing. You know, evangelizing church is the same as or pretty close to an evangelizing church. Okay, same thing. All right. So then the question we're going to be looking at is, how do we go about being and becoming an adult church? Okay, what does that look like, and how do we go about doing it? Okay, and I'm going to use an image for this today. Okay, the image is a dock. Okay, it's a nice dock in a nice water, calm. Let's go there. No, wait, we're here. No, we have to stay here. Okay, and what I want to propose is that dock is an evangelizing parish. Okay. All analogies have weak spots, and this one does too, okay? So, but just bear with me as I go through this, okay? And each of the little planks on the dock are ways in which the parish is being formed in being and becoming an adult church. Okay? Pretty cool so far, right? Okay. So we know what some of the planks are then. There's going to be programs for adults, there's going to be catechist formation, there's going to be parish gatherings, there's going to be sacramental formation, peer group sessions, scripture study, youth ministry, and all kinds of other things that are about shaping a people to be and become an adult, and be and become adult church. We're going to talk about that a bit more in a bit. Okay, so this is great. So we get all these things together, we line them all up, and we put them in the water as the dock. But they all fall apart because they're not connected. Okay, so it's like, then they float out and a big wave comes and some of them sink and it's a mess. Okay, so that's not going to work. Okay, we have to think about, okay, then what do we have to do? Okay, well, we need to first put in place the framing that we build the dock on. You can't just put boards on the water, huh? Okay, so we have to put the frame that we put the boards on. Some of the things that make up the frame is that it's rooted in liturgy, that it's oriented to evangelization. Okay, those are some of the framing pieces that make up the foundation on which we put process and programs and ways of being in relationship. Okay? Other things include there's a level of inclusiveness, that everyone is engaged in the process, that it's educationally sound, that that we're engaging in formation, that we're engaging in being and becoming a church in a way that's educationally coherent, educationally sound, that it's multi-generational. I use the term multi-generational in my writing, not because I often think when we use the term intergenerational, it ends up sounding like mom and dad and little kids. Do you know what I mean? That's often the image we get of intergenerational. Kind of, it really means the parents of second graders and their kids going on a retreat. Okay, that's often how it gets translated, as a matter of fact, in many parishes. What I would argue is for a multi-generational, which means all the generations are involved, sometimes together, sometimes apart, sometimes in small groups, sometimes in lecture. So everybody's engaged, okay? Not necessarily together all the time, though sometimes they are together. Okay, so I find multi-generational a bit better than intergenerational, which sounds like we're always with one another. I have teenagers. I don't want to be intergenerational with my teenagers. Why would I want to? Okay, all right, so we build this now, okay, and then we're going to make it part of that, kind of frame those in. See, now we got this, put it on the water, and there it goes. It floats away. Well, that's not very helpful. How are we going to get on it? We want to be talking about this is what we're actually talking about today, the foundations, the pilings that are sunk deep into our tradition, deep into our identity, deep into our way of being, that serve as the foundation around which we build both the frame and the boards. I think sometimes in some parishes, probably none of your parishes, I'm sure, but I think sometimes in some parishes we do programs and then we set them off and we don't know why they sink. Sometimes I think they sink because what we need is some foundation pieces in place. Okay. Now, I think there's a lot of them. I mean, I think there's more than the three I'm looking at. But these three, I believe, are key. They connect very clearly with what it means to be a person of adult faith that John just talked about. And they give us a way of moving in the direction of being and becoming an adult church. And the three of them are hospitality, conversation, and followership. So those are kind of like the pilings that we build the dock on. Okay, hospitality, conversation, and followership. And actually, the way I use conversation is very similar, almost identical to the way John uses dialogue. Okay, it's word choice, not much difference. Followership. I will be. Okay, yeah, followership. I know follower. Who wants to be a follower? Lamb. Bah. Okay. All right, but we're gonna, because in fact what we want to do is, absolutely, what we want to do is we want to look at that, my argument here is that capacity for conversation, genuine conversation, okay, which addresses to some extent that question of how do we help people to begin to question this superego God. One of the ways to do it is to have them in conversation with other people about things that matter in their lives. Because it is, in fact, when we recognize that our lives are not, they're not doing well with this superego God. And when we hear, even better, other people speaking about a relationship with God, that we begin to make some shifts, begin to think differently. I remember very clearly working with a group of adults. It was a sacramental formation program in the parish where I live. This is one of those times when everybody's there, and many times it's that the women are there, the mothers are there, and but there was one group for some reason. I had a group of about 5 guys who came every time. Okay, so they took over the guy table in the back, okay? And which was great. They had some great conversations, and at the end of one of the conversation periods, one of the guys said, we were talking about prayer, and he said, I've never even thought about prayer in the way that he does prayer. Wow. And that he does prayer is somebody he was sitting around the group with, some other dad, and that sense of his kind of yearning for that is the beginning of that movement from a potentially superego God to a living God. Okay, capacity for conversation, effective followership, radical hospitality, all those are feeding one another. See, what I want to do for each of them is to deconstruct our present usage, okay? Because I think in each case, each of them, followership, hospitality, and conversation, we have a certain kind of common usage of how we use that term, and I think we need to deconstruct that a bit. I think it's been minimalized. Then I want to look at the scripture and tradition to say, how could we use this term? What are the resources to rethink those terms? Then proposing an alternative understanding, and then drawing some pastoral implications. Okay, you can see why I'm only doing 3. Okay, you're like, all right. So the first thing I want to do is this notion of hospitality. Now, when we think of hospitality, and if you look up hospitality on Google, which my primary research base is Google, okay, we have things kind of like hospitality room, hospitality industry, hospitality committee, okay. You could also get hospitality mints, okay. Hospitality furniture, okay, all kinds of things for hospitality. In each of these cases, hospitality has been reduced, I think, in some ways, to being nice to one another, or to personalizing a potentially impersonal experience. So I go into the hotel, and I register in the hotel, and then when I call from the phone, we're in my room to ask for something, they answer with, "Yes, Miss Regan, how can I help you?" Okay, how did they know that? Okay, well, no, they didn't remember me. No, this is not my friend. Okay, my name comes up on the caller ID. Okay, do you see? And that's part of their understanding of hospitality. I like it. I mean, I like mints on my bed at night. That's so sweet. Come in, your little chocolate on your pillow. But so I'm not against that kind of hospitality, but that's not all of hospitality. Okay, or a hospitality committee in a parish. Great. Coffee and donuts after Mass is great. I like it, okay? That's not everything, though. And as a matter of fact, for some people's experiences, parishes that are really good at being hospitable to one another aren't always all that hospitable to outsiders. Okay, so that's not always a good thing. Okay? So it seems to me that we're talking about hospitality, that it basically connotes comfort and convenience, okay? And it's often either based on agreement or coming from our excess. Like, we don't offer hospitality from our own need. We offer hospitality from our excess, often, okay? And that's certainly the way it's being used kind of in contemporary culture. So hospitality is really throwing nice parties. Again, a good thing, but not a foundation on which to build a parish, okay? So to look at hospitality in Scripture, we can look at 3 different stories, which I just want to talk about very quickly to kind of get a sense of what's going on in those stories. Each one of these would be a great study to say, what's hospitality like in our parish community, okay? The first is the visitors for Sarah and Abraham. Okay, you have the scene, they're in the desert, because that's where they live, they're nomads, and they're wandering around, and somebody comes to visit, okay, 3 people actually come to visit. And because they're nomads in that culture, hospitality wasn't just something you had to do because it was nice. It was essential, because you can't simply send somebody off, good luck, God bless, next tent is, across the desert to the right, you really do have to, in fact, offer hospitality for living, for survival. And they did. They offered hospitality. They extended that hospitality. They welcomed the guests in. They came. And in that experience, in fact, they welcomed angels. And in many of the stories within the Old Testament particularly, that when we welcome the stranger, we in fact welcome God, okay, and welcome angels and messengers of God. It was out of that context then that Sarah was told that she was going to have a child, and it was really the beginning of the father, Abraham's role as father of many nations, the promise that God had given him. So that notion of hospitality then, first of all, is that in welcoming the stranger, we welcome God. Another piece to this that I haven't really worked in here yet, because I'm working on a book. This is the outline, okay. So any ideas will be well received. But another part of that welcoming the stranger piece is that sense in the Old Testament particularly that the Israelites understood themselves as strangers. We are strangers in a strange land. That sense they were always exiles. There's something more there that I want to play with in looking at the Old Testament stories. But then let me look at the next one, which is the parable of the great banquet. That's the story about guys holds a big banquet. He goes and invites everybody in, and one couple says, well, we can't because we've got Super Saver tickets to go to Bahamas, and we can't lose a ticket, so we're going to the Bahamas. We're not going to your party. See, when they first got the invitation, they understood it to be an invitation. And they were quite excited because this guy throws really good parties. Okay? After a while, it became an obligation. They put it on their calendar, like another thing on the calendar, And it just happened that the tickets to the Bahamas came up and overlapped with this party, okay? Oh, well. See, it's an obligation that I'm balancing out rather than this invitation, okay? They can't come. Another one just bought a house, and the closure is that day, and he has to be there at the closing, and there's some difficulty with inspection, and okay, he can't go. So he goes through all these people who had been invited and said they were coming, who now says they're not. Out of that came the extravagant gesture of welcoming in anybody. The lame, those who are on the streets, inviting everybody in. That was an extravagant gesture, beyond belief. Most of Jesus' parables are, in fact, beyond, at the time, we listened to them and nod while we're kind of making our grocery list in our mind kind of thing. But in fact, for people who first heard it, who would do that? You've got to be kidding. You just wouldn't do that. okay? And continue to invite people in. And the house still isn't full, fine, go back out again and get some more. That welcoming in the ones who in fact are not welcome. That's the key. That sense of hospitality. And it's a hospitality that is extravagant. It's beyond belief, okay? In some ways, it's beyond belief the way a living God is beyond a superego God. It's beyond belief. It's beyond belief to love. And then finally, we have the story of the sheep and the goats. That's a great story where, everybody's kind of getting ready to get into heaven, and they get separated out. And to one group, he says, when I was hungry, you gave me to eat. When I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. And they said, really? Cool. Okay? And to the other group, when I was hungry, you didn't feed me. When I was thirsty. They said, when did that happen? No, I've been paying attention. If I'd seen you, I would have. If I'd seen you, I would have. But they didn't see. They didn't see the stranger. They didn't see the other. Okay, so it's that sense of how do we see? It's seeing with hospitable eyes. It's seeing with extravagant generosity. Okay, hospitality. So that ultimately the sheep and the goats, one of the key punchlines to that one is that it's essential to following Christ, to who Christ is. That we're called to be extravagantly hospitable. Not just because we are going to be welcoming God, but because we are going to be welcoming the other, and that's our job. Okay? Hospitality. Okay, so what does this mean? What does this look like in terms of a parish? How does a parish become are you getting the sense of hospitality? Because hospitality, again, all of these actually, isn't something we do, it's a way that we are. Okay, so it's not that we need to get somebody to do hospitality in the parish. Hospitality committees are great if they're serving as catalysts for the broader experience of hospitality. Okay, so how do we become a hospitable parish? I think first of all, make it a habit of hospitality. How are people welcomed and greeted in our parish communities? And how are they welcomed and greeted not just in the church, okay, not just coming into the church building, but in general? How do we meet people? How do we greet them? I think one of the primary expressions of hospitality in a parish community is the person who answers the phone. Okay? You get it? Okay. Nobody in this building has a secretary like this, but I've heard about secretaries. Say no to the good. You want to have your job up? Great. Okay. Are you a member here? You're not. Oh, you are. You think you are. Okay. Well, we have a program that lasts this long, and envelope number, please. Okay. Fine. Never asked, boy, girl, how you doing? Are you exhausted? When did you sleep last? Okay. It's about here. It's not about welcoming. It's about setting up the demands. The more I listen to John, the more I'm seeing that some of what I'm saying, this is just from, is that's the difference between a superego God and a living God. Superego God is about, you a member here? When were you last here? What's your envelope number? Okay? I'm sorry, if you're not an active member of the parish, then we don't do baptism with people who are not active members of the parish. Right? Does that make sense? And the thing is that I want to be really clear. This living God isn't just, in my sense, John can correct me if I'm wrong on this. This living God isn't, oh, sure, who cares? No, the living God cares deeply, but not about laws, but about the relationship. So the welcoming is to welcome at a time when the person is reaching out to grab it and not to slap it. If they're reaching out their hand, we grab the hand, we don't slap the hand, okay? Secondly, creating hospitable space. Our parishes, many of them are lovely. Where do we gather, though? What's that experience? What's the experience of welcome and warmth? I'm not talking about a building campaign, although goodness knows many of our parishes could use a building campaign, but how do we make the connection between our gathering for liturgy and kind of the gathering of the community before and after that? You know, what's that experience like? And how do we foster that? How do we enhance the welcome of the appearance of welcome? What does our website look like? Our parish websites. How are they welcoming? You know, all of the ways in which our parish welcomes. How much information is on the billboard thing in the front of the church? How much of that is accurate? Now, this sounds silly, but it's not. Okay? It's ways in which we reflect that hospitality. A second element of a hospitable parish is to recognize who is not present. That's a power of what they call within educational circles as a null curriculum. What do we say by what we don't say? Or what do we say by who we exclude? All right, so how do we, as a hospitable parish, how do we become more aware of who is not present? Okay, quick story. Parish, this is a story about a congregation, actually, that was during, right at the beginning of the U.S. involvement in World War II. And it happened in Chicago. And there was a congregation there, fairly conservative, you know, just small, in Chicago, kind of in the city, kind of Chicago. Now, during that time, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, many Japanese Americans, as we know, experienced a good deal of prejudice and discrimination. And one such group was a small community of Christians who were meeting in a storefront, kind of for their church. You know, they'd rented a storefront. And well, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, their contract ran out, or their lease ran out, or their lease was canceled, whatever. And they were evicted from their place to worship. So they went around to all the Christian communities in the area to get permission to use their place for worship. And they would say, you know, we don't need much space, we just need, and we'll come at a time that you're not using it, we just need a place to gather for prayer and for fellowship, you know, for support. Okay, all right. Nope, sorry. Oh, geez, no, we're busy place. All the rooms are used all the time. No, can't. No, you can't. Okay, so they're finally getting to really about the last chance, this fairly old, staid church in Chicago, and they're thinking, this is going to be a waste. But anyway, but they go, and they talk to the elders about their need, you know. We won't take up much space. We'll use it at a time you're not using it. We just want to use it for fellowship and prayer, okay? And so the elders of the congregation hear their story and say, okay, you know, thank you very much, and we'll talk about it. And so they began to talk about it and back and forth a bit. And then the pastor said, well, listen, let's wait. We'll vote next week. Okay, everybody talk to people in the congregation. We'll vote next week. So next week comes, and they get there, and so there was a good deal of buzz in the congregation about it, kind of like, you know, what do you think, blah, blah. And really, it was probably, you know, fairly heavy against. Okay, and so that was kind of the plan everybody had going in, was that they would just vote and say, geez, we'd love to, but we can't. We'd love to, really. So they get there, they're settling down, and there's a knock on the door. And it's this older woman who'd been teaching Sunday school in that parish, so that everybody on the parish group had her in Sunday school. Okay, long time. Okay, she knocks on the door, and she asks if, you know, can I please come in and speak to you for just a moment? And so of course they have to say yes. Yes, please come in. So she says, you know, you're talking about something really important here today. In fact, it was so important that all the Sunday school teachers met yesterday to talk about this, last night, to talk and to pray about this. And I was sent from the Sunday school teachers to tell you that if you don't welcome these people in, then we can't teach Sunday school anymore. Because we cannot tell the children about the love of God and the lordship of Jesus if we don't welcome the stranger. Well, I don't know what the conversation was like after this woman left, but they did. And that congregation then, for the next 50 years, 60 years, has been the place where the other is welcome. They were in the forefront of the civil rights movement. They've been one of the places where gay and lesbians have been finding refuge and a place to worship. Why? Because once you recognize the other, you can't not recognize them. You know what I mean? Once you see them everywhere. So once again, they began to see with hospitable eyes. They couldn't not see anymore. And they were compelled by the gospel to welcome. And then finally, becoming a hospitable parish. As parish community, and I'm not sure what this looks like actually, so I'll just put it out there. There's something I know it's true for people. Do we need to practice giving from within our own need rather than from our excess? You know, I think many of us can be really hospitable with excess, with what we have left over. But how do we speak about it in terms of what we have as what we need? You know, and what you know, kind of our buffer, you know, against the onslaught of a questionable economy. Does that have an impact on what we give? Okay, a look at hospitality. How is your own hospitality quotient? With people in your community, with strangers to the community, and then with strange ideas. How hospitable are you to strange ideas, to strange beliefs or positions? That's a form of hospitality as well. How do we welcome people in? And where is hospitality most clearly expressed in your pastoral setting, and how might that be enhanced? Excuse me, those are good questions. We're not going to, you know, we'll pick up on other questions later on for a small at your table. But I think that sense of hospitality and the challenge of that is really rooted in our own personal hospitality and our own willingness to welcome the other. And one of the ways, if we go back for a minute to that notion of our hospitality with strange ideas, positions, and beliefs, one of the places where that comes up is in the context of conversation. Okay, remember, these are going to be the poles that we're going to build the framework for the dock, and then the dock that is our parishes that are an adult and evangelizing parish. Okay, conversation. Again, conversation. You know, that goes everywhere from the, you know, the kind of all over the place chat that parents have while they're watching their kids play soccer, you know, to a confrontation or goodness knows, like a, you know, a television talk show kind of thing. All of that kind of gets named as conversation. So we have, you know, chat and the debate, argument, all of those get labeled under conversation. And I think for the most part, what we're really talking about here is either kind of this kind of not bad, but not terribly helpful kind of just chit-chatting. Or often we have what's really just a series of monologues. You know, I talk, and then when I'm finished talking, you do your monologue, kind of regardless of what I said. My mother, my mother died this summer, my mother used to always say, and we would roll our eyes, of course. My mother would always say, "That reminds me." Okay? And that would be her way of totally changing the subject and doing her monologue. Okay? And that, I mean, I think it's many of us experience that. Oh yeah, that reminds me, and then she's off. Okay, and you can count on whatever you were talking about not being seen again in that conversation. That notion of chat. A couple of resources there just to look at that are actually quite interesting on this and talk about how we begin to rethink this is Deborah Tannen and Robert Keegan's books. Okay. And this connects very clearly with the material that John had talked about in terms of how Jesus was experienced, how God was experienced in both in the Old and the New Testament in terms of conversation. We have that great conversation of God with Abraham. It was actually shortly after the welcoming of the strangers. That great conversation about whether or not to save Sodom, Gomorrah, one of the places, from fire. You know, and he kind of argues God down. Okay, well, suppose there were like 50 good people. Oh, okay, all right, for 50, yeah, okay, for 50 I'll save it. Okay, but what if one of them's out of town? Okay, there's only 49, then what? Okay, and eventually just for one faithful person, God would save the town. Seems to me that when we're talking about conversation in Scripture, we're talking about three things going on. First of all, both parties talked. Unlike the superego God, where basically we're told what to do, with this kind of notion, both parties talk. Okay? Both parties listen. In other words, there's an interchange there. The story of the woman at the well, I think, is a great example of that kind of an interchange. Or the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus. That interchange, that you say something and I say something. Jesus clearly responded to their question, or more deeply in the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, Jesus responded to their need, their confusion, their insecurity, their inner feelings was what he was responding to. And then the third is the conclusion only came clear in the exchange. In other words, neither party knew how it was going to end till it ended. Do you see what I mean? So there was a sense in which it's not like God is thinking all along, I know I'm not going to burn the place down, I just make those kind of threats all the time, don't do it. But then he makes Abraham go through all these steps of, how about 50, how about 48, 25, 11, 2, 1. Okay, but God wasn't going to do it anyway. He's just pretending. It's a pretend conversation for God. I don't think that's true. Or Jesus talking with various believers. It's not like Jesus is doing that as kind of an exercise or like an example. Okay? No, Jesus is doing it as a human being in conversation and doesn't know how it's going to conclude. We had that story of Jesus talking to the rich young man. And we have Jesus, kind of engaging him in a dialogue, and the young man basically in the end saying, oh, too much. And it says, Jesus looked at him with love. Jesus was sad. Oh, he was really disappointed. It had been a really rich conversation, and Jesus really thought this kid was really going to come along. And he didn't. Rats. I don't know if Jesus said rats, but rats. Okay. All right, conversation. Now, I think many of you who've heard me speak in other contexts know that I think John probably agree with this. That really most college professors have about 4 things they say. 3, really, 3 or 4. John may have 5. He's a full professor, so he may have 5 things he says. And basically, we just kind of repackage them in different packages based on what we're teaching. Okay, but basically, there's really 4. I thought I had a lot more to say. When I first started teaching, I don't, okay? But one thing that I say all the time, and one of my things to say, is that adults grow in their faith. Adults learn faith, learn in the full sense of learn faith, best in conversation with other adults about things that matter. That's how people grow in their faith, in conversation with other adults about things that matter. So that's where I think, I'm going to skip that one, sorry. That's where I think we need to talk about conversation within kind of a parish setting and what it looks like. This is a quote from David Tracy, Plurality and Ambiguity. Most of you are alums, you probably recognize David Tracy, certainly. Conversation is a game with some hard rules. Say only what you mean. Say it as accurately as you can. So you can't say it just to make the point sound really good. You have to be accurate. Listen to and respect what the other says, however different or other. Your hospitality quotient, Be willing to correct or defend your opinion if challenged by the conversation partner. Oh, darn. Be willing to argue if necessary, to confront if demanded, to endure necessary conflict, to change your mind if the evidence suggests it. See, conversation that we're talking about here, conversation is a very risky thing. It's risky not just because the other person might not agree with me, okay, but it's risky because I might have to change my mind. That's the risky part. Genuine conversation means I might have to think differently about this, or about this person. Okay, that's risky. Okay, making conversation work. Again, we're talking about in a parish context. The first is have great expectations. That is, presume when you give adults the opportunity to talk to one another, they will, and they'll talk about important things. Again, when I'm working with adults in a parish setting, one of the primary places I'm doing it right now is in sacramental formation. And as I'm giving them into small opportunity for small group conversation, I say, you're adults. You get to talk about whatever you want to talk about. I'm not going to put a monitor in every group or anything. I said, but let me tell you something. You can talk about the new soccer coach, the principal of the middle school, the swine flu. You can talk about all that stuff almost anywhere. Okay? You can't talk about what you believe, what gives meaning to your life. I find I can't do that at Stop and Shop, wait for my number to be called at the deli counter. I can't do it, And so this is an opportunity that you're not going to have again for a while, many times. So how do we say to people this? So yeah, obviously you can talk about what you want to talk about. You're adults. But boy, don't let this opportunity go by. And when said that way, many, many times, the conversation is really a rich one. Okay? So that sense of have great expectations. Secondly, give it pride of place. Anytime we gather adults for absolutely anything, really, we ought to have opportunity for conversation about issues of faith, issues of anything that matters, that's faith, okay, the things that are important to us, things that give meaning to our lives. What often happens is you're giving a presentation and the presentation goes over and so you cut out the conversation, okay? It actually should be the other way around. Oops, I'm running out of time, so click through these, time for conversation. Because we often have it as kind of what we do if there's time. And how do we think differently about that? Be sure that it's well hosted, and that gets to the next one, preparing good questions. I think one of the hardest things to do, those of us who are engaged in religious education or pastoral ministry in any way, is to ask good questions. To prepare good questions. As a matter of fact, I'm teaching a weekend course, and that's one of the things we're going to be spending a lot of time on this weekend, is on how do we prepare good questions. Questions that aren't so fraught with church talk as to be unintelligible, that don't make presumptions about other people's homes or home life. So when you were growing up and your family had people over, okay, not necessarily. So how do we ask questions in a way that people aren't already thinking, no, I can't do that. So if we ask how, oh, this is great. This was, my kids were much little. I was living in Minnesota. And we were talking about standing around after church, getting our coats on, and one of the women who was very wonderful woman, wonderful kids, wonderful kids. Anyway, it was during Advent. And she comes up and she says, don't you just love singing O Come, Emmanuel with your children while you do light the Advent wreath? Yeah. Advent wreath, I knew I forgot something. It's like, or we had an Advent wreath, but it's like we didn't always remember it. Come on, this is the real life. No, I don't. Okay, how do we ask questions, invite conversation in a way that isn't already putting another layer of guilt onto the adults in our parish community? Yes? And see, I would disagree with you, because while I think this is good for face-to-face, I think much of the same model is used, and preparing good questions, having great expectations. If that's not in our parish setting, that's just all I want to do for now, just because I don't have control over internet. I wish I had invested in it, though, is to say, in what way do our parish websites Genuinely invite conversation. Is there a blog with it? Yep. Is there opportunity for discussion? So that's all. I'm little on my movements, but we have through School of Theology and Ministry, we have a blog for catechetical leaders. Right now we're talking about books we read in parish book clubs. So I think we can still ask the good questions, and we need to presume. It's one of the elements about the internet that we need to be more and more aware of is that it's got to be a two-way. It's not just what we say to the recipients of our website, but how does it form a dialogue? That's a good example. Okay. Let's take a interlude, as John so nicely says. When do you experience this kind of conversation? Or where does conversation happen in your own pastoral setting? Okay? 3 minutes. Two things on this. One is I'm an introvert by nature. Okay, and so I, in fact, when they talk about getting into small groups, I roll my eyes. Okay, I believe in this stuff, and I roll my eyes. Okay. Well, there has never been a time that once I've gotten into a small group that I don't really, really enjoy it. So it's like, I don't know why I do, but I'm conditioned to kind of, oh my God, small groups. But boy, I think to see the energy and kind of the intimacy in the way that John was talking about intimacy in conversation, it's great, and we need to do it more. I remember someone saying to me one time, well, isn't that kind of just the blind leading the blind, adults in conversation, that kind of thing. And I said, well, it depends on the question. If you're asking about the understanding of a 3rd century Armenian text, yeah, it's the blind leading the blind, Or if you're asking specifically about the intricacies of a church teaching, yeah, I gotcha. But that's not what conversation is for. Conversation is about what does this mean for you and your life? Adult conversations ask the most important theological question we ask: so what? So what does this mean for your life, for how you raise your children, for how you spend your money, for how you engage in your community, for how you understand yourself in the world? That's the most important theological question we ask, ever. And that's what adult conversation is for. Okay? And adults have the capacity for finding the information they need to find. Okay? So it's not essentially information giving, but rather it's a transforming experience in the way that John was talking about. Okay. Now let me talk about followership. Follower, boy, that has bad press, doesn't it? I mean, who wants to be a follower? Who wants your kids to be followers? You want your kids to be leaders, ever to excel, or whatever we say here. Okay. Contemporary usage: sheep, obedient, docile. Right? This kind of follower. Kind of the, really put faithful in front of it. Faithful followers. Oh, man. And adults, really. Yeah, we don't want to be followers. If we look at Scripture, however, the Scriptures give us stories that invite a much more active, vital, compelling invitation to followership. The fundamental words of Jesus were, come, follow me. Be a follower. Okay? Not go start your own show. Come, be a follower. We have in that high priestly prayer in John, which I'm just going to make mention to and tell you, go read it again. It's a great, that sense of that those followers have become his friends. Okay? But they're still his followers. They're followers. Okay? And the post-resurrection appearances have much the same tone to them. As followers, they were being sent out, but still as followers. So the images that we get from those scriptures, and kind of if we look at those and play with them, we can talk about three key ideas. First is the understanding of apprenticeship. Now you're going to notice, let me just put this caveat out already, I'm not going to use the term discipleship here, okay? Not because I don't think this is what it is, but because we so overuse that term that I just want to, in order to really unpack followership, I want to avoid using kind of the terms we usually use. I believe that this is discipleship, okay? But it's a different way, a new way of thinking about it. So we have this notion of apprenticeship. What does an apprentice do? I have a friend who was an apprentice to an iconographer. She was learning to be an icon maker. And she said that what I really learned was not just how to make icons, but how to be an iconographer, you know? It's like, how do you attend to your tools, set the rhythm of your day, think about your work, live your life as an iconographer? How do those pieces go together? And that's at the heart of the notion of apprenticeship. And then it's an apprenticeship to a way of life. So we're followers of a way of life, not followers of a set of beliefs. Again, once we move from that superego God to a living God, being a follower is not so bad. If we're a follower to a superego God, then we're following rules, we're following commands, we're following what we have to do. If we're a follower with a living God, we're in a relationship, a rich relationship. And finally, in each of these, it's a followership in which we're gathered to be sent. The point of following isn't just to follow, but to then be effective followers, be followers who bring that way of life out to others. With adult faith, this is an essay that I wrote in Prophetic Witness, Catholic Women's Strategies for Reform. With adult faith, the locus of one's faithfulness shifts from received teachings, defined identity, and external authority. It shifts toward creating meaning within personally appropriated teachings, self-identity, and internal authority. So we're talking about faithful followers here. We're talking about people who are faithful, not in the sense of faithfully following, but faithfully living. Just a second. That these women, but they're women who are this is fostering the next generation of faithful women. They're women who are faithful in the process of being and becoming church. In other words, they're not necessarily, their followership isn't following the church. It's following with integrity what it means to be and become an adult church. Does that make sense? You get the difference? So that I think, the notion of followership has been way underappreciated. One of my beliefs is that, and this is one place where I first began to really think about this, is when the whole sexual abuse crisis here in Boston and elsewhere came on, along with some poor leadership, there was some really poor followership. There were a lot of followers who weren't challenging. There were a lot of followers who didn't raise issues. There were a lot of followers who followed what Father said or what the bishop said. Now, I'm not saying then that, they're not culpable in the same way, obviously, but I think we need to be really careful of, if we're the church, then we're the church. And that means to be church is to be this faithful follower. Oops. Oh, I know it's expired. It throws off my clicker. Sorry, I need to do it this way. I can't. There we go. Faithful followers. Faithful followers assume responsibility. they serve the vision and the leader. See, they serve the vision and the leader. The vision first and the leader. They challenge the leader in light of the vision, and when necessary, the vision itself. Does that make, am I making sense? You see how this could be really rich? Yes, Sue.
Are there steps to this? I mean, do you have to have an identity first? Is it a received identity? Is it a learned identity? And then does it become a personal identity? I mean, do you have to have one before you can have the other?
Well, I think you have something behind that. Go ahead. What are you thinking?
You know, there's the discussion about being faithful. There's let's just say it's a rich discussion.
Yes.
About being faithful and about identity.
Right.
And so therefore to be able to identify yourself as a Catholic.
Right.
Then how do you learn how to do that? Now, once you learn what it means, you know, what the definition is, and take it as your own. So is that the first step?
Yeah, I see.
One with one's experience, with one's life, then it becomes a personal identity with maturity. I mean, I don't know.
Well, see, I think this gets back to much of the stuff that John was saying in the first half of that the move. It seems to me you can't be a faithful follower, or it's a challenge. Yeah, no, you probably can't. You can't. There really isn't anything to be a faithful follower about if you have a superego God and a superego church. Does that make sense? It's like superego God, superego church don't do that well with faithful followers. They do that way with followers. Okay. Kind of blind followers, sheep, docile followers. But so that in order to do this, to engage in assuming responsibility, challenging, etc., that needs to happen. So that at some level, I don't know if there's a first and second, but there's a yes, yeah, exactly. I think it's a continuing moving through that that experience. Yeah. Okay. I want to invite you now. We have about 10 minutes, okay? Right? And so I want to do is invite you into conversation at your table for about 3 or 4 minutes. And I know, small times, not good. Bad example. I know. And then we can raise questions for the whole group, and both John and I will be here to answer.